So now that we've seen how the different components work together to create a particle system, let's take a look at a specific production example. So in this case, what we're going to try and do is create a realistic smoke type effect. And we're just going to work with the native XSI basic particle billboard and some of the fractal noise patterns. In addition, we're going to end up keying some of the parameters or tuning some of the actual particle settings to achieve the overall look. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is just create the particle system. So I'll do a particles from selection. And if we just play that back just to get a look at what the default particle behavior gives us, it sort of spits off from all directions there off the object. And that's because the generation of the particles is created off the surface of the object. So if we want to get something a little more uniform, there's a few different options we have here. What we're going to do is use the volume option. So it comes from the interior volume of the object and emits in one direction. So this way we can get the trail of smoke we're looking for. And there's a few things right away that you want to start tuning to just approximate the overall effect that you want. So right away we can see we don't have nearly enough particles. So we're going to increase the rate of the particles to 600. So we get a much denser, thicker look. And you can notice most settings in the particles have a variability option. If I just move this over a bit, here you can see as well you have a variability here on the end of these guys. And what that is basically, instead of writing a random expression to kind of vary the parameter, you can just add a variability number there, and that parameter will vary between that range, plus and minus that range. So the next thing, we're looking at the particles. We can see them accelerating away from the object fairly quickly. So by decreasing the speed to something like 4, we get them moving a lot slower, kind of simulating a slow-moving fog look, not much inertia to it. The one thing we want to do is increase the spread because fog or smoke generally expands over time and kind of pushes away from itself. So by increasing the spread there, we get this kind of expanding look to it. So that's looking much closer to what we want. The next thing we want to look at, if we go in the Overview tab, and this is a good time to mention the actual layout here. There's quite a few PPGs because there's a lot of settings for the particles, obviously. But what we tried to do was have the Overview tab contain some of the most common parameters you're going to use. So things like the color of the particles, the life of it, the size, the mass. They're all found on the Overview page. But as you go and drill down into more specifics, you'll see here the life setting is found again. So it's basically been duplicated in multiple spots. But along with the setting, you've got more options to set the criteria of the actual parameter. So for example, here we want to adjust the size of the actual particles. So what that means is if we set the criteria to age percentage, we're basically not basing it on time anymore, but rather the age of the particle. So if we go to the beginning of the timeline and set the size to 1 and key that, what we're basically saying is when it's born, make it a size of 1. When we go to the end of the timeline, so at 100% of its age, since we're on frame 100 there, and we set this to 3, we'll say at 100% of its age, set the particle size to 3 and key that. So when we play that back, we've got this sort of ever-expanding particle as it gets older. And of course, we can always go in the animation editor and tune this. What I'm going to do in this case actually is just change the actual ramp in and ramp out a little bit because we want the particles to kind of be born, expand very quickly, and to give us that thick, smoky look. So by just adjusting the handles here, we'll just ramp into that larger size much quicker. So it's just a little bit of a fussy thing, but that really makes a big difference in selling the look of the actual particles. So let's play that back again. So you can see here there's a quick expansion of the particles and they get to their large size and basically stay at that large size for quite a while. So that tends to give us more of a realistic look for smoke. Next, let's look at the actual transparency of the object. And this is a place that I see often that people, they'll get particles popping in their render or flickering and they don't know why. And a lot of times it's because they're not correlating the transparency of the particles to its actual age. So, for example, when your particle is 100% of its age, at the next frame it's going to die. And if your object's 100% transparent, it'll just pop and disappear when it dies. So what you want to do is ramp the alpha down to 0 by the time you get to 100% of its age. So there's kind of a gradual fading off of the particle like that happens in real life rather than it just disappearing. So again, what we want to do is set the alpha to age percentage and then go to the beginning of the timeline. What we're going to do is when they're born, we want them to be 50% transparent. So I'll set that to 0.5. The color, let's just set it to something like white. We're just going to leave that constant over the entire duration. So we'll set that to 50%. We'll go to the end of the timeline. Now, at 100% of its age, we want this to be 0. So fade it out completely and key that. So if we play that back now, you can see we're getting a smooth, even in OGL, you can see them fading off as they die. They don't just pop and disappear. So that's exactly what we were looking for. One more thing I want to adjust actually on the particles. You can see how they all have the same kind of direction and it's fairly uniform. Kind of they're all pointing up. What we want to do is give a slight rotation for each billboard so they kind of spin outwards, mimicking kind of clouds that kind of roll outwards, that kind of billowing cloud effect. And to do that, what I want to do is just go in the General tab, and you can see we got the billboard rotation velocity. So we can control on every axis for roll, pitch, yaw. You can set those all independently based on whatever criteria you want. What I'm going to do is just add some variability to the rotation of the particle. So 90-degree variability. So each particle will sort of rotate randomly within the 90 degrees kind of. So you can see here now we're getting a bit more a noisy look. The particles are rotating in different directions. And that gives us a much more natural look. So let's just draw a render region here. So you can see we're obviously I need to do some work on the shader. We're getting this kind of flat gray look. So let's take a look at the actual P-type. So notice you have the cloud selected and you go into render tree. You'll have all the P-types listed, and those are really the objects that you want to be inspecting to work on, because basically each P-type has its own render tree, its own shader look. So you want to edit the specific P-type rather than the actual material on the cloud, which is basically controls more global settings like the BSP stuff. Not something you access very often at all. So once we get to the P-type, let's just go into our actual billboard settings here. So the first thing you can see for rendering properties, the surface normal, basically each billboard will have a normal associated with it or multiple normals. And what we can do is right now it's set to billboard, so it'll just be seen as a flat kind of card effect, which is good for a lot of situations. But in cases where you want more of a 3D volumic look, if you go to spherical, you can see immediately now you're getting kind of more of a volumic cloud look. And what it does is it basically bends the normals to fake this kind of spherical look for each billboard. So each billboard renders more like a sphere. And that way we kind of get more of a volumic kind of shading look. Another thing you want to do is play with the burn. So I'm just going to go forward a bit here so we have a few more particles generated. So by bringing the burn up a little bit, we can further increase the kind of detail and stuff we pick up. So you can see here we're getting greater contrast, more highlights. Basically what the burn does is as billboards overlap each other, this overlap will cause an increase in the luminosity of the actual billboards in question. So as you have more overlap, you'll get greater burn, so it'll eventually burn out to white. And that kind of creates more of a 3D volumic look. So you can play with that a little bit to create a more realistic effect. So you can see we're starting to get a kind of a cloud look. Something we want, if we go down further to the shape, what we want to do is add some noise now into the cloud. So by just using large sprites and a noise pattern, we can simulate the effect of more particles and kind of a more detailed cloud effect. So I'm going to set it to turbulence right now. So you can see right there, right away, it made it more transparent by adding the noise in there and a little more grainy. So it's got a bit more of a kind of a cloud effect. So the turbulence, we can adjust some of the options on the actual turbulence setting. So let's set the scale to something like 3.8. So you can see the noise has been introduced to a greater degree there. Just to show you, let's ramp that up very high, 6. We'll leave it at 4 for now. And we can set the frequency of the noise. So I'm going to set this to 1.6 and the high frequency to 6.4. So it's hard to see there, but if we just maybe expand it here, you have a greater sense of detail there in the actual cloud. So we go to the falloff tab, and this basically controls how the actual billboards fade off as they approach the edges. So it's a really important setting to control the blending between billboards or any particles. And that's actually one of the big problems with particles or sprite-based approaches, is you often get this granular look because the fading from one to the other isn't continuous. So it ends up looking very chunky. So there's a few solutions. You obviously increase the number of particles, increase their size, and increase the fall off, so you get smoother blending. But again, each of those has a different trade-off. Increasing size, you lose some detail. Increasing the transparency, you get it looking soft. So it really is a matter of juggling the different parameters to get the look you want. So for the fall off, we can go with, say, a smooth fall off. So you can see right away it becomes a lot more wispy, a lot softer. Gaussian, a little less soft. You can see the edges a bit more. We're going to go with the square fall off. And we can actually, for all of them, modulate the range of the actual fall off. So we're going to start at 0.34. So we actually start the fall off at that point, and then we end it at, say, 0.85. So before we actually reach the edge of the billboard, we're faded off to 0, so we get some nice soft edges there. So it's looking pretty good. So there you go. You see it's kind of got that wispy smoke, and a lot of the randomizing things like the noise and adding the rotation help give it this kind of curvy effect. Something I definitely suggest is to start playing with some of the forces like turbulence, which mimics natural wind patterns, different small wind patterns, and just adding a turbulence force in there to kind of diffuse the actual smoke and spread it out makes a big difference in the actual effect, as well as adding gravity just to give it a bit of weight to it. But overall, that's kind of a few of the important settings you need to tune to create an overall smoke look using the default shaders. As we continue, we'll look at more complex examples of particles.